Hey there. So for this week's Hot Topics, we are going to dive into the world of suicide and self-harm risk assessments, looking at our duty to warn and the counselor's role as far as school districts' duty and liability. This is a really important topic, and so I really want to make sure that we touch base on this since we didn't get a chance to do that in class. So please, write down any questions that you have as we go through this. But this is something that will come up at any grade level. It's definitely more likely to happen at the middle or high school level, but I was an elementary school counselor, as you know, and I did encounter this at that point too. So just please be comfortable and prepared as much as you can. It never gets easy, but it does get a little bit better once you have a really good understanding of your role when a student is expressing suicidal intent. So negligence is a word that is really important for you to know and understand. And so negligence is the risk of liability. So negligence means that you are purposefully or knowingly not providing the service or the care that you are supposed to provide. So we owe a duty to another person. We owe a duty to that student to provide the most care that we can within our means. When we are negligent, it's because we have not lived up to that duty by reasonable standards. And because of that failure to live up to that duty, we have caused damage to another person. And so if we look at this with a suicide or self-harm kind of through that lens, when we are aware that a student is suicidal or expressing those feelings, that's our duty is to get them help. And when we don't get them that help that they need, or when we don't at least inform and let the parents know to our best ability, then that does cause damage because the student could potentially complete suicide. So I'm sorry that the bottom of the screen is cut off, so I'll try to I think it's just one word, but we'll get there. So our duty owed, what we have to do when a student indicates suicidal ideation, it could look a lot of different ways. It could be perceived. It could be a friend. I've had friends come and say, you need to see this kid. They're saying they want to kill themselves. They could directly disclose it to you in a session. They could write it I've had on several occasions, like an English teacher has said, hey, you might want to check in with so-and-so. They wrote this in their journal. And if any of that information is presented to us, then the clock starts on that duty to inform. And so when we're given that information, we have to do something with it. If a student denies those feelings, but there's other indication, do not believe them. So I know that sounds really kind of crazy to say, but if the student's friend comes to you and says, you really need to check in on Sarah, she's saying she wants to kill herself, and then you call Sarah down and Sarah's like, what? I don't know what she's talking about. She's crazy. It doesn't go away. We still at that point have that duty to warn, and you have to let the student know that, my job is to keep you safe, and because this came up, I do have to let some people know what is going on, and there are other people that are out there in the community that can do some deeper digging to determine whether or not that's true. Our job is not as much to investigate, but just to make sure that someone is taking care of that. So there's a court case from 1991 that did find that school counselors have a duty to inform parents of suicidal ideation of students, citing in loco parentis. If you have not heard of that term, we'll talk about it a little bit more, I think, here on the next slide. But basically, in place of parents is what that means. And when we are at school, all of the adults in the school building are in place of the parent. And so they have that duty at that point to care for the safety of that child in place of the parent. So basically, legally speaking, adults in a school stand in the place of parents. And when the parent is not there, we are responsible for their safety. So pretty powerful, but also legally binding. So here's when our liability is transferred to the parent. So when we are in loco parentis, we have to do a couple of things, and then we transfer that liability to the parent, because then as soon as the parent is involved, in the safety and responsibility then transfers back to the parent, who's the primary caretaker and who's responsible for that minor. So when the counselor has notified administrators and parents that the student is at risk, and that notification is well documented, here's where your confidentiality sort of goes out the window. And there are ways to do it sensitively. Of course, we don't want to document in our school counselor, or I'm sorry, in our like Power School log, or in our student information system log, that the student was suicidal. But you do have to have some sort of documentation. At my previous district, we had like a Google folder that was somehow encrypted, and we would upload our risk assessments into that folder. Was it perfectly confidential? I don't know, but that was what was required. And so we did that. You could keep your own documentation, but there has to be something that says when and how you notified the parents that student was at risk. You also have to provide resources and recommend further action. There's a lot of debate as to whether a school can require a student or a child to access mental health services before coming back to school. Some school districts do it, some are hesitant to. It kind of just depends on what your district chooses to do. And then if the parent does not secure those mental health services, it is a hotline if it's not within that reasonable timeline, because we have to understand that parents are not going to necessarily feel comfortable with making that call. And so we have to give them some space and time, but we also have to keep in mind that there is some urgency to the situation if a student has, especially if they have attempted. So if that does not occur, I have hotlined many times for parents who just didn't take it seriously. And, 2 weeks go by and the student says, I haven't gone anywhere, I haven't done anything, and that's not okay. So, and that time frame can be determined by your district. It could be just told to you, or it could be something that you maybe decide with that student, or that is just sort of up to you. Self-harm kind of goes with suicide, but it's not always indicative of suicidal behavior. It can lead to accidental suicide, though. And it's also, of course, a risky behavior that needs to be addressed. So it has to be treated similarly to suicide. If you're made aware of a student self-harming, you have to treat it as though it is a danger to that student, even though in most cases, it's a coping strategy that just needs to be replaced with some other coping strategies. We know that when students are self-harming, they are either punishing or releasing. They need to go to therapy. They need to figure out which one of those actions are occurring. So are they punishing themselves, or are they releasing tension or stress? Some of them are doing a little bit of both, but they need to go to therapy to acquire those replacement behaviors. As amazing as you guys are as school counselors, we cannot go that deep with a student. And so at that point, that duty to warn, that liability falls on, you have to make sure that the parent is aware and that the parent is taking action. There have been times where I've had to send a student home because they have harmed themselves at school to a point where they're, really injured. And so they have to leave. And so, work with your nurse, work with your admin, and kind of see what the recommendation is from your school district. Again, with all of this stuff, you're probably going to have a district policy that you need to adhere to. And so just kind of look and see how it mirrors your own ethical and legal responsibilities. So we're talking about hot topics. So every hot topic we'll talk about ways to stay cool. So a way to stay cool, this is, again, something that's really scary. And it does not really ever get easier, but you will get more comfortable with it as you continue on throughout your career. The first thing to do is to just make sure you're really aware of what your school wants you to do. Memorize that process. Some school districts maybe won't have anything for you. And so if they give you a process, use that process. If they give you a form of documentation, use the documentation. So I don't love to screen kids. I think it's kind of almost a waste of time. I think even the slightest indication that a student is having suicidal feelings means that they have suicidal feelings, and I don't think we need to quantify it by giving it like a 1, 2, 3 risk level. However, your school district might say that you need to do that. And so if that's the case, then you do it, because your school district is not going to back you up if you didn't do what they asked you to do. So follow their protocol. If they don't have something, you have to go to bat for your kids, and you have to advocate for the creation of such a policy. So at Hogan, there was nothing. And so I've spent all year working with the Student Services Department on creating something. In the meantime, I kind of just made my own, and I just gave it to my principal, and I said, here's what I'm doing, and this is how it's going to go, because there's nothing in place. And he was on board, and he said, yep, I'll support you, and this sounds good. And that's what we did. In the meantime, a district policy is being created. And so if you work for a smaller school, you may have to create something or kind of have a part in that. Provide all documentation to the parent. So you circle numbers on a risk assessment. You take notes. There's a journal entry. You gotta give it all to the parent. I know we want to protect our kids, and we want that confidentiality piece, and we want to keep that trust. Trust kind of has to go out the window a little bit. You have to break that confidentiality, because you have a duty to take care of that student. I always tell my kids, when this kind of stuff comes up and they're like, oh, I don't want you to tell my parents, and then they get kind of mad, I say, I'm really sorry, but I have a duty to keep you safe. It's my job to protect you, and I would rather you be mad at me than dead. And sometimes when you put it to them that bluntly, that's what they need in order to understand that you are doing what you're doing and telling their parents and going through all this out of love and care for that child. So anything you have, any paperwork or documentation that you have, give to that parent. Not only is that covering you in a liability situation, but it's also helpful to the parent, because then they can pass that along to the mental health professional, who will have a better, kind of more well-rounded sense of what's going on. So that is our hot topic of the week. So next week we will dive into mandated reporting. So be thinking of any questions that you have or things that you want to know more about with mandated reporting. So what you'll do now is you will have a discussion board that you will need to respond to. And so be looking on Canvas for that. And hopefully I've answered some questions that you might have. I'm sure most of that was just a review, but these hot topics are so important. And I really am looking forward to reading your discussions and your thoughts on that. Thanks so much, guys.